I'm writing this just a week after the devastating floods in Texas. Floods that swept away hundreds of lives and forever changed the communities they touched. As often happens, the sermon at church that Sunday felt perfectly timed, as it was a retelling of the Good Samaritan. In this parable, Jesus answers a wealthy man's question about how to inherit eternal life. He tells the story of a traveler who's been beaten, robbed, and left half dead along the roadside. Two men, both respected religious figures, see the injured traveler but pass him by. Adding insult to the man's injuries, they cross to the other side of the road to continue on with their day. Then comes a Samaritan, a man that any listener from Judea would have regarded as an other. The Samaritans were a people of mixed ancestry, descendants of Israelites who had intermarried with foreigners after the Assyrian conquest centuries earlier. Pat McCloskey, a Franciscan friar, helps us understand just how deep that animosity ran. He writes, "Imagine the hatred between Serbs and Muslims in modern Bosnia, the anger between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, or the feuding between street gangs in Los Angeles or New York, and you have some idea of the feeling and its causes between Jews and Samaritans in the time of Jesus. And yet it's the Samaritan, the one everyone expected to turn away, who stops. He tends to the man's wounds, pays for his care, and makes sure that he'll survive. When Jesus finishes the story, he asks a simple question. Which of these three was a good neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? Pro-immigration advocates are having a hard time in 2025. America, a nation that formally separates church and state, still turns instinctively to Christianity for its moral compass. And yet our policies often bend that faith to serve other ends. Donald Trump, the self-proclaimed champion of the religious right, regularly invokes Christianity, even while admitting he's never asked God for forgiveness, and once referred to the Eucharist as his little cracker. His first presidential term was defined by the border wall. His second, it seems, will be remembered for mass deportations of both undocumented and legal immigrants. Already this year, Marines have been deployed to Los Angeles. Masked ICE agents have drawn comparisons to the Gestapo, and in Florida, a new detention center dubbed Alligator Alcatraz has opened to hold detainees awaiting removal. While anyone with questionable status can be targeted, the focus has fallen hardest on Latin American migrants, particularly Mexicans, Venezuelans, Hondurans, and Nicaraguans. One of those caught up in the net was Narcisco Barranco. Barranco was working as a landscaper in Los Angeles when ICE agents surrounded him. Video shows masked officers tackling and beating the 48-year-old before hauling him away. He spent 20 days in federal detention. I myself have done nothing to earn my citizenship. That was given to me, a birthright of geography. I'm hardworking, law-abiding, and pay my taxes. But that's not what makes me an American. It's just what I do. Barranco, though? He's done far more than I have. He married an American citizen. He raised 3 sons who all became U.S. Marines, 2 active duty, 1 a veteran. Clearly, he instilled in his children a deep love for this country. And yet, despite having no criminal record, Barranco still found himself on the wrong side of this administration. Unfortunately, there are thousands of stories like this. Men, women, and children swept up in the deportation frenzy of Trump's second term. But the story I want to end on isn't about who America cast out. It's about who came to America to help. After the floods in Texas, while our government was building walls and spreading fear, Mexico sent search and rescue teams to help us recover. Despite the barriers, despite the talk of 65 million meals for alligators, despite a 30% tariff that gutted the very trade deal Trump once bragged about, Mexico came to our aid. So I'll ask again, which one was the good neighbor? You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's dark history of xenophobia. Episode number 4, Deportation Nation. Racism, more than its cousin xenophobia, saved Mexico from America. When President Polk sent U.S. troops into disputed territory, he ignited a war meant to seize the land he had first tried to buy. The conflict succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, but that victory collided with a 19th century fear known as race suicide. That ugly concept came from thinkers like American eugenist Robert A. Ross, who warned that intermarriage and immigration from inferior races would dilute the white population until it vanished altogether. Enter John C. Calhoun, the South's leading defender of slavery and white supremacy. He pushed to limit the spoils of war, making sure the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo included only half of Mexico's territory. The new border delivered land, lots of it, but minimized how many brown bodies came with it. If that sounds harsh, listen to Calhoun's own words, spoken on the Senate floor in 1848. "We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of incorporating an Indian race. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The great misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on an equality with the white race." In other words, America took the land, but rejected the people. Still, about 80,000 Mexican citizens found themselves living on what was suddenly American soil. To our credit, they were given the option of American citizenship and the supposed protection of their property rights, even if they chose to remain Mexican citizens. It's why in Mexican-American history classes you'll often hear the saying, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." Integration wasn't easy, but over time, Latin American migrants, especially in the Southwest, have woven their culture deeply into the fabric of American life. Tex-Mex food is as common as barbecue. Spanish is the most taught foreign language in public schools, and Taco Tuesday, Cinco de Mayo, and salsa outselling ketchup all tell the same story. American culture absorbs, borrows, and celebrates even those it once rejected. Most debates about Latin American migration, though, revolve around economics. And here's where things get messy. As a long-time debate coach, I can't stand double talk, when someone argues two contradictory things at once, hoping that one of the two arguments will stick. But that's exactly what happens with Latin American migrants. We get what I call Schrodinger's immigrant. Somehow hardworking enough to steal all of our jobs, yet lazy enough to live off welfare. It's nonsense, but it's powerful nonsense. That contradiction fueled Donald Trump's 2024 campaign. Calling the border an invasion, he claimed a mandate for mass deportations, leaving advocates shouting into the wind. Both sides accuse the other of politicizing a tragedy. But it isn't politicizing a disaster if the disaster is political. Historian Juan Gonzalez reminds us that U.S. economic and political domination over Latin America has always been and continues to be the underlying reason for the massive Latino presence here. Quite simply, our vast Latino population is the unintended harvest of the U.S. empire. In country after country, generation after generation, Washington's penchant for intervention policies, both military, economic, and political, have profoundly shaped the migratory currents that brought tens of millions of Latinos to the U.S. The Latino migrant flows were directly connected to the growth of the U.S. empire and responded closely to its needs, whether it was the political need to stabilize a neighboring country, to accept its refugees as a means of accomplishing a broader foreign policy objective, or an economic need, such as satisfying the labor demands of particular U.S. industries. In simpler terms, America created both the push and pull factors driving Latin American migration. We've destabilized governments, opened markets, and then act shocked when people come north seeking safety or opportunity. If that's an invasion, then it's one we engineered ourselves. The answers to our current crisis aren't new. They're historical. We've been here before. The masked raids, the camps, the walls, none of it is unprecedented. So let's look backward at the history of Latin American migration, the xenophobia that shaped it, and the policies that built the steel door between us. A door that opens and closes not by reason or justice, but by fear. Actor John Leguizamo, while promoting his show Leguizamo Does America, reminded audience that the first European language spoken in America was not English, but Spanish. He states, "We've been here since 1492, and to see that we're being rounded up again for the fourth time in this country, it's incredible." The first of those roundups came during the Great Depression, a period when, as historian Erica Lee notes, Mexicans were targeted for mass deportation like no other group. It wasn't their fault, but with record unemployment, Americans were desperate for someone to blame. Mexicans made up only 1% of the U.S. population, yet nearly half, 46% of all deportees during the Depression were Mexican. The irony? Many had been invited here. U.S. employers actively recruited Mexican workers for jobs no one else wanted. Racist pseudoscience even worked in their favor. One boss claimed Mexicans were fitted by natural environment to withstand our climatic conditions and perform physically demanding work. Another praised their unique crouching and bending habits, supposedly suiting them for agriculture. Years later, comedian Stephen Colbert tested that myth for a bit on his show, picking beans and packing corn alongside migrant workers. He testified to Congress afterwards, stating, "I started my workday with preconceived notions of migrant labor, but after working with these men and women, picking beans, packing corn for hours on end, side by side in the unforgiving sun, I have to say, and I do mean this sincerely, please don't make me do this again. It is really, really hard." Colbert's punchline captured a hard truth. The work is brutal, and few Americans want to do it. The Baker Institute puts that in perspective, writing that agricultural jobs tend to be physically demanding, pose risks such as pesticide exposure, are often in remote areas, and do not offer a career ladder. Even in periods of high unemployment, American-born workers do not view agricultural work as viable. Yet economic and population growth have increased demands for fresh produce. In this context, immigrants play a vital role in keeping the agricultural sector working. Today, foreign workers, both documented and undocumented, play a disproportionate role in ensuring a reliable supply of food for American households. Before the Depression, Many of these workers were follow-the-crop migrants, moving from state to state as the seasons changed. Americans, by contrast, wanted stable, year-round jobs. This mobility fed two familiar xenophobic myths: that migrants were transient criminals, and that they took local jobs without putting down roots. Ironically, today's immigration policies have mostly ended that mobility. The USDA reports that 83% of hired crop workers now stay in one location, and only 4% follow the crops, as the threat of deportation has made travel too risky. The system worked until the Depression, and as always, economic crises fuel xenophobia. Mexican workers had built California's fruit and vegetable industries, but by 1930, Congress had slashed annual Mexican immigration from 62,000 to just 2,457. Cutting off European and Asian immigration was simple. You just controlled the ports. The southern border, though, stretched nearly 2,000 miles. To cross it all on foot would take over 100 days of walking 8 hours a day at a brisk pace. Stopping cars or small groups became nearly impossible. Even the libertarian Cato Institute admits that the much-hyped wall was a failure. In a report titled "The Border Wall Didn't Work," Cato wrote, "While it was always obvious why the wall would never stop crossings, the border wall may actually have been counterproductive. The roads created to build the wall now serve as easy access points for smugglers. Trump may claim Biden's border policies explain the failure, but Biden has maintained virtually everything in place since Trump's 2021 declaration of victory. The wall has not done anything. Illegal immigration would disappear without a wall if it were legal for immigrants to move to the United States. That's the only reform that will create lasting progress at the border." That illegality was created on March 4, 1929, when Congress passed a law making it a crime to enter the U.S. without papers. Lee explains that the laws applied to all immigrants, but they were designed to impact Mexican immigrants specifically. For decades, Mexicans had been encouraged by labor agents to enter informally, without inspections, head taxes, or records of entry. The new laws suddenly made these typically Mexican ways of entering a crime. Common laborers became innocent victims of a situation they are not guilty of creating, sociologist Emery Bogardus observed. Mexicans became the quintessential illegal alien and the illegal alien criminal. Deportation authority existed under the 1917 Immigration Act, but was rarely used against Europeans or Asians. It was just too expensive to ship them home. Mexicans, by contrast, made up 85% of all immigration prisoners in the 1930s. This new quote-unquote crime also led to a new kind of police, the U.S. Border Patrol. As Lee notes, its earliest recruits came from groups like the Texas Rangers and the Ku Klux Klan, organizations with their own traditions of racial brutality. In its first decades, the patrol relied on violence and fear to control the border, acting as what Lee calls instruments of racial terror. As the Depression deepened, local governments passed nativist laws banning the hiring of non-citizens. Many Mexicans left voluntarily, but not fast enough for Washington. Herbert Hoover's Labor Secretary, William Doak, created a dragnet meant to terrify others into leaving. He even proposed sending federal agents to Los Angeles to create what he called a psychological gesture, a show of force that would scare many thousand alien deportables. This campaign became known as repatriation, and in their zeal, authorities didn't bother distinguishing citizens from non-citizens. California Congressman Joseph Dunn later estimated that 60% of those expelled were actually American citizens, many born in the United States. Journalist Becky Little, writing for the History Channel, describes the raids for us, writing that the raids tore apart families and communities, leaving lasting trauma for Mexican Americans who remained. They were carried out with little or no due process. Local officers arrested people in public places and loaded them onto trucks, buses, or trains bound for Mexico, regardless of whether they were documented immigrants or native-born citizens. It was, she writes, the 1930s equivalent of raiding the Home Depot parking lot. Repatriation slowed in 1934 as the economy recovered. President Franklin Roosevelt still excluded foreign laborers from most New Deal programs, but he stopped short of mass deportations, fearing it would punish entire families. On the local level, though, the purges continued, this time under a new excuse, that Mexicans were a public charge. In Los Angeles, relief workers were told to lie to families, claiming all aid would be cut off unless they volunteered to go back. One Chamber of Commerce member later admitted that Mexicans were being forced out through coercion or actual starvation. To make it more efficient, California struck a deal with railroad companies on both sides of the border. $14.70 per adult, half that for children. Lee adds that negotiators even discussed lowering the price if they could ship 200 people at once. Whenever government policy creates winners and losers, it's worth asking, who profits? In the 1930s, it was the railroads. Today, it's private prison corporations. The nonprofit outlet Truth Out reports that two multi-billion-dollar companies stand to earn millions under Trump's renewed deportation push. ICE contracts make up 43% and 30% of their revenue, and their stock prices jumped more than a third the day after Trump's re-election. GEO Group's executive chairman George Soley called it an unprecedented opportunity in his call to shareholders. Hidden inside the Depression-era repatriation law was another cruel detail, as it made re-entry illegal, even for U.S.-born children. Lee writes that the repatriation program's effective de-Americanization of an entire generation was not lost on observers. The Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce admitted that this means that something like 60% of these children are American citizens, without very much hope of ever coming back into the United States. Historians estimate that during the Depression, a third of Los Angeles' Mexican origin community was expelled or coerced into leaving. President Dwight Eisenhower, one of the most decorated generals of World War II, understood the costs of militarization. He once warned that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world, he said, was humanity hanging on a cross of iron. But Eisenhower also knew that when wars reach your shores, survival depends on having enough workers to build the arsenal of democracy. During World War II, that demand transformed the American workforce. Women became Rosie the Riveters. African Americans migrated north, fueling what would become known as the Harlem Renaissance. And from the South came hundreds of thousands of Mexican laborers, ensuring American troops were well fed and supplied as they fought fascism abroad. It was called the Bracero Program, a temporary 1942 labor agreement between the United States and Mexico that lasted more than 2 decades and brought in over 4.6 million Mexican farm workers. On paper, it was a partnership of necessity and goodwill. Mexican laborers would receive fair wages, housing, and medical care in exchange for keeping America's food supply and railways running during wartime. It was sold as hemispheric solidarity, two nations united against a common enemy. And in part, it worked. Mexican laborers picked cotton in Texas, harvested vegetables in California, and laid railroad tracks across the Midwest. They helped sustain both soldiers and civilians. Some earned more money than they could ever back at home, and a few built long-term lives in the U.S. But behind the official promises lay a harsher reality. Wages were routinely stolen. Housing conditions were disgusting. Medical care was inconsistent or non-existent. Before even reaching the fields, the Mexican farm workers were stripped, deloused, and sprayed with DDT, processed like livestock. Their temporary contracts left them vulnerable to exploitation, with little recourse against abusive employers. Speak up, and you risk deportation. Meanwhile, domestic farm workers, many of them Mexican Americans who had been here for generations, were forced into a race to the bottom, competing with the new workers for lower pay. What began as an emergency wartime measure hardened into a system of dependence, one where American agriculture relied on cheap, disposable labor to thrive. By the early 1950s, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Corruption and abuse within the Brochero program led many workers to bypass it entirely, entering the U.S. without papers instead. Employers often preferred hiring undocumented migrants. They were cheaper, more vulnerable, and easier to control. Under mounting pressure from labor unions, nativists, and politicians in the Southwest, Eisenhower responded the way a general might, with an operation. In 1954, he launched Operation Wetback, a mass deportation campaign led by General Joseph Swing, head of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The very name, a racial slur, revealed the dehumanizing logic of the project. Immigration agents conducted raids, roadblocks, and sweeps across cities and farms. Thousands were detained, including U.S. citizens of Mexican descent. By the end, more than 1 million people had been deported, many dumped deep into the Mexican interior with no food, water, or way home. Families were torn apart. Some died of exposure in the desert. Newspapers hailed the operation as a triumph of law and order. Eisenhower declared the border secure. But it didn't last. Within months, many returned. The labor demand hadn't gone away, and neither had the poverty that pushed them north. The United States needed these workers. It just didn't want to see them. Operation Wetback didn't fix the system, it only exposed it. America wanted cheap labor without the laborers, profit without people, and a border that could open and close on command. The Brochero program officially ended in 1964, but its shadow still lingers. It laid the foundations for the modern guest worker system, for our debates over illegality, and for the contradictions that define border policies to this day. Because at the heart of all of this lies a question we still haven't answered. Do we want the people who pick our food, build our homes, and sustain our economy? Or do we only want their cheap labor? At the heart of this history is the same question asked in the old parable. When we meet our neighbor on the road, tired, sunburned, and bent from the labor that feeds us, will we pass by, or will we finally stop? Because after all these years, from the Brochero camps to the border wall, the question hasn't changed. How long can a nation call itself good if it refuses to be a good neighbor? Things were supposed to be different in 1965. That year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, abolishing the discriminatory national origins quotas that had shaped U.S. immigration since 1924. As you'll recall from an earlier episode, those quotas stacked the deck in favor of Western Europeans, shutting out much of the rest of the world, particularly Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Lee writes that the United States had finally established an immigration policy consistent with our national philosophy that all men are entitled to equal opportunity regardless of race or place of birth. It also ushered in a new era of mass migration, predominantly from Latin America and Asia, both of which transformed the United States. But she adds an important caveat. Xenophobia did not end with the 1965 Immigration Act. Johnson's moving declaration of an end to discrimination only masked the perseverance of xenophobia, and the rise of colorblind xenophobia still shaped and motivated by racial anxieties and bias. Under the new system, there were no longer individual country quotas. Instead, there was a global cap, and no single nation could make up more than 20% of total immigrants in a given year. That meant countries with low demand, like Belgium, would never hit their ceiling. But high-demand nations, Mexico, India, China, quickly faced decades-long waiting lists. The result? A complete rewrite of America's immigration story. As post-war Europe prospered and the Iron Curtain froze migration from the East, far fewer Europeans came. Meanwhile, economic hardship in Latin America and Asia drove migration in the opposite direction. Between 1981 and 1990, 85% of all legal immigrants came from those regions. Politicians quickly saw an opportunity. Lee notes that critics of the Johnson bill subtly connected immigration to America's existing race problems with African Americans and other minorities. Southern Democrats and their conservative allies fed into fears of black and brown immigrants flooding into the country and displacing whites. The American Coalition of Patriotic Societies even warned that the law was a Trojan horse at our gates, from whose dark bowels can emerge into our midst 1 million alien misfits a year. Two competing visions of America emerged. On one side, multiculturalists reframed the nation's story, shifting the mythos from Plymouth Rock to Ellis Island. America, they said, was the world's greatest experiment, a multicultural democracy where anyone could rise through grit and determination. The other side painted migrants as invaders, job thieves, criminals, cultural outsiders. Even as Latinos and Asians made up a growing share of legal immigration, Mexicans became the central focus of a smear campaign in the decades that followed. By the late 20th century, overt racial slurs had fallen out of favor, but a new target took their place: illegal immigrants. From the 1980s onward, that term became almost synonymous with Mexicans. Erica Lee reveals that between 1965 and 1995, leading U.S. newspapers increasingly paired the words undocumented, illegal, or unauthorized with Mexico or Mexican immigrants, as well as with words such as crisis, flood, or invasion. And that's where psychology takes the wheel. When media outlets, politicians, and pundits repeat the same pairings, Mexican and illegal, immigrant and crisis, our brains start to link them automatically. Psychologists call this associative networking. It's why hearing peanut butter makes you think jelly. Repetition fuses ideas, even when they don't belong together. And that's how implicit bias takes root, not through malice, but through repetition. People may not realize they've absorbed those associations, but they react to them all the same. Over time, these shortcuts form the foundation of stereotypes, mental habits that reduce millions of unique individuals into one flat, oversimplified caricature. Even neutral words, when paired with negative ones, start to carry the same weight. This is causal embedding, the idea that language doesn't just describe reality, but shapes it. If immigrant is constantly surrounded by words like problem, drain, or threat, that framing eventually becomes instinct. That's the power of narrative, and it's also the danger. Many Americans believed they were simply responding to facts. In truth, they were reacting to decades of framing, headlines and sound bites that rewired public perception click by click, story by story. And once those mental pathways are built, they're incredibly hard to undo, especially in a world where modern media keeps us locked in separate echo chambers. The roots of this divide aren't new, but they've grown deeper over the past few decades. In the late 20th century, the rise of 24-hour cable news changed everything. Before the 1980s, most Americans got their news from the same three nightly broadcasts: CBS, NBC, and ABC. While imperfect, they largely shared the same facts, the same frame of reference. But with CNN in 1980 and later Fox News and MSNBC in 1996, news became a constant presence. And more importantly, a product that had to sell attention around the clock. Sensationalism became survival. News wasn't just reported, it was performed. Networks realized that loyalty didn't come from neutrality, it came from taking sides. Audiences self-sorted into ideological tribes. Then came the internet and the paywall. Quality journalism moved behind subscriptions, while cheap, emotional, and often false content flourished on social media. Misinformation was free, addictive, and profitable. And social media made everything worse. Platforms like Facebook, YouTube, X, and TikTok run on algorithms built to keep you scrolling. These systems learned that what drives engagement isn't balance, it's outrage. Posts that confirm your worldview or attack another group spread fastest. And each time you engage, the algorithm feeds you more of it. That's how we got trapped in algorithmic echo chambers, personalized worlds where our biases are constantly reinforced and empathy for others slowly erodes. History tells us this kind of polarization has consequences. In earlier eras, from the Civil War to the Red Scare, extreme division made it easier to justify the suppression or deportation of outsiders. What we're seeing now is an echo of those same patterns, a media ecosystem that profits off division while starving us of nuance and empathy. So when someone hears the word immigrant and instantly thinks crisis or crime, it's not just prejudice. It's the result of a half-century of headlines, politics, and algorithms, all teaching us, in ways we don't even realize, who to fear and who to ignore. There are two iron laws of immigration. First, supply and demand in the labor market will largely determine the flow of migrants. Second, periods of economic disruption will always produce xenophobia against those same migrants. In 1964, America ended the Bracero program. In 1965, it established a waiting list for Mexican migrants seeking legal entry while simultaneously stepping up deportation efforts. On paper, this combination should have reduced migration. The federal government had shrunk the supply of legal workers, but it did nothing to curb corporate demand for their labor. In the late 1950s, American corporations relied on 450,000 Mexican guest workers. After the Mexican farm worker program ended, the legal pool dropped to just 20,000. Ignoring the law, Mexican workers continued to cross the border in search of high-paying jobs. American companies pretended the rules didn't apply to them and hired them. As illegal crossings grew, immigration became a hot-button flashpoint in the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. Politicians rarely offered solutions. Instead, they leaned into the xenophobia stirred up by economic uncertainty during the Reagan years. Reagan's reforms targeted employers, but were only marginally effective. Owing to his boss's failure, George H.W. Bush later redefined employment-based visas, creating a lottery system to bring in migrants from historically underrepresented nations, and established temporary protected status for countries facing conflict or disasters. Bill Clinton campaigned on being tough on crime. His policies barred undocumented immigrants from public benefits like welfare. Despite this, the myth that migrants drain government resources persists. Clinton also expanded the number of offenses that could trigger deportation. Lee writes, "The result has been what many have called crime-agation, the merging of criminal and immigration law. Immigrants, both undocumented and lawfully present, become subjected to a double standard that allowed the U.S. government to inflict far greater punishment, deportation, than the crime. For example, traffic offenses, merited and treated non-citizens far more harshly than citizens." George W. Bush entered office hoping for comprehensive immigration reform. His campaign had benefited from strong support among Latin American voters. But illegal immigrants can't vote, so he constantly favored stronger border security. Most legal immigrants agreed with him, as they expect newcomers to follow the same legal process they did. But then came 9/11. The newly formed Department of Homeland Security created 3 new agencies: ICE, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Suddenly, the federal government had vastly more power to track, arrest, detain, and deport migrants. From 1975 to 1995, Lee tells us that the U.S. averaged 29,000 removals per year. By 2000, the number jumped to 188,000 deportations. Each subsequent administration has broken that record. Barack Obama was labeled the deporter-in-chief. His policies focused on high-priority migrants, those deemed threats to public safety or national security. He completed 651 miles of border fence and expanded migrant detention from 33,000 to 360,000 beds across 200 facilities. Yet Donald Trump still portrayed him as weak on the issue. Lee tells us that by the time Donald Trump was running for president in 2015, the idea that Mexican immigration constituted an invasion of criminals who threatened the country had been well established and even normalized. Trump was just repeating a message that had been gaining traction for decades. What was so curious about Trump's view of Mexican immigration was how outdated it was. Mexican immigration had indeed increased during the late 20th century, but it was no invasion. In 2000, foreign-born Mexicans accounted for only 3% of the total U.S. population. The total Hispanic population in the United States remained a relatively small portion, 13%. By the time Trump was calling for a border wall, net migration from Mexico was below 0, meaning that more immigrants were returning than arriving. Undocumented entries had plummeted to historic lows, and the undocumented population was at its lowest point since 2003. Trump's crackdown may seem unprecedented, but history has echoes. Deporting migrants to countries they have no ties isn't new. During Japanese internment, the U.S. collaborated with Peru to send Japanese Peruvian citizens to American camps, with no due process. History shows these harsh measures don't solve migration. Decades of enforcement haven't reduced crossings. Instead, they push migrants underground into risky networks and away from integration. The American Immigration Council writes that rather than making a substantial investment into building a better system, past presidential administrations have repeatedly relied on aggressive enforcement and deterrence-based policies. The failure is manifest. No one believes the problem has been solved or even alleviated. A sustainable solution requires rethinking migration. Ironically, the only sure way to reduce immigration is to crash the American economy. Migration from Mexico dropped during the 2000s, when the Great Recession was paired with a strong Mexican economy. But deliberately weakening your own economy is self-defeating. A smarter approach is regional partnership. NAFTA and its replacement, the USMCA, show how trade can create both winners and losers. While politicians often frame U.S. auto production as lost jobs, consumers benefited from cheaper cars. Agriculture also seems a winner, but Lee notes that American agricultural companies flooded Mexican markets with corn and other grains. Unable to compete, 2 million Mexican farmers and farm workers were forced out of agriculture. They migrated first to large cities in Mexico, then to the United States, seeking economic survival. The solution isn't simple, but it also isn't impossible. The first step is dispelling myths about Latin American migration. Actor John Leguizamo puts it plainly. I'm going across America looking for Latin exceptionalism, Latin innovation, Latin genius, celebrating all the things we brought to this country that we get no credit for, that were ignored and erased. America needs to show up for that story. Immigration isn't just about laws or borders, it's about stories. For too long, migration has been framed through fear. Research now confirms what artists and educators have long known. How we talk about migrants matter. Words like invasion, flood, or crisis prime fear. Stories centering human beings, their dreams, struggles, contributions, foster empathy. Reframing immigration through personal stories works. Studies show audiences are more likely to empathize and support inclusive policies when they hear first-hand accounts. Narratives that emphasize shared values and aspirations have measurable impact. This is happening now in Leguizamo's work, in community theater, social media campaigns, and oral history projects. Rewriting the migrant story from fear to belonging is thankfully underway. Walls, crackdowns, and harsh policies may shift the path, but they don't erase the journey. People move to survive, to dream, to hope. Take Alex Diaz, a 23-year-old bus driver from Honduras. He's not a criminal, nor is he a caricature. He tried to do things the right way, waiting for a U.S. asylum appointment. But the system failed him. Policies had shifted across presidential administrations. Restrictions had tightened. He was left with nothing. He said, "I don't want to come in illegally, but Trump can't take the American dream from me." Migration has always been about hope, not lawlessness, not exploitation. Hope for something better. Hope for safety. Hope for a life that values their labor and recognizes their worth. If we want a functional system, a thriving country, and a story that includes all of us, we must start with the truth. People like Alex Diaz are not threats. They are testaments. Testaments to perseverance, to resilience, to what it means in the deepest sense to believe in America. So I ask again, who is the good neighbor? Is it the walls we build, the policies we enforce, the fear we legislate? Or is it the person who stops, sees another in need, and chooses compassion over convenience? The story of migration remains the story of our humanity. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.